I've got all the cutting boards now trimmed to size, out of the clamps, glued up, trimmed to size. End up using my Festool track saw to do both edges. In fact, the front edge was no longer square. I think the bow clamps had kind of tightened it up, so it was a little bit bowed along this very bottom edge. So I first squared that, I first made that straight with a cut on the track saw, and then made this 90 and this 90, so those are parallel. I left this top edge, this is going to be the back edge, all three kind of goes this side, across the back, and then the other side. And I left this long, so I'm going to install all of them and then make one long cut across this back edge, and then put the edging, on there all the way across the back when I'm done that. I also cut the plywood pieces, so these get mounted onto plywood, and elongated, made holes. This has about 16 screws to pull this down, and used a spade bit to recess those holes. So the screw goes in there, washer goes in there, and into the bottom of the butcher block. I did have a little bit of an uh-oh moment. My plan was to put some finish on the bottom of this. This is the bottom side. So I kind of scraped it pretty flat, and then I was going to put some finish on it. I figured a couple coats of finish on the bottom, so that in case any water gets trapped underneath or whatever, hopefully it won't soak into this butcher block. So I went to start putting finish on, and then realized as I was putting the finish on, or about 5 or 10 minutes into it, just slopping it on there, spreading it over, it was soaking up. As it was soaking into there, it was pulling into the end grain here and started to warp this whole thing. As the end grain was soaking up that finish, it was expanding, and the whole thing started bowing significantly. And I was like, oh, right, finish both sides. So flipped it over. I hadn't started working on the top yet, but flipped it over and just started applying finish to the top. So this is the front. You can see, you can probably make out there's still a bunch of epoxy lines, but I just started throwing finish on top, and that pretty much did the trick. So this is now back to where it was. It's still slightly bowed, which is where it was to begin with. So put finish on the back, started to swell, flipped it over, also applied finish to the top. So I don't expect that to be a problem, certainly hope not, but I do have to go through now and kind of sand this top, which I had to do anyway, which will remove most of the finish, and I don't expect that to be any sort of problem. I can smooth and flatten and polish this top, and then reapply the finish. So I've got a couple of coats of finish on the underside of all three of these countertops. I've got the plywood cut and mounted, now taken back off to put the finish on, but I've got it all cut, ready to go for all three. So now what I'm going to do is put them onto the plywood base, tighten that all up, make sure that looks really good, and then I'm just going to leave it on there for the rest of the operations, which is basically to level this top and sand it, polish it to make it look really great, and then put some finish on it. Oh, one step I'm going to do before doing all that sanding is I'm going to fill some of the cracks with epoxy. So, from some of the milling operations, maybe I got a little divot or the clamps didn't quite pull it tight. There are definitely a few areas where there's a gap. Where the glue or the epoxy, didn't pull the two pieces tight, and so there's just a little bit of a gap in a couple locations. So I'm going to inspect these tops. I'm going to find any of those gaps and put tape around it, and then just dab some epoxy to go down into that gap. Let that dry, and then scrape that flat, and then of course sand and finish the whole thing. The epoxy has dried overnight, and I forgot to mention that I actually put wax paper between the butcher block and the plywood. In case the epoxy dripped down, I didn't want it permanently attaching the plywood base to the countertop. So I just put some wax paper in between. Again, the plywood is just screwed to this countertop, so in case I ever want to take it back off, just take out the screws and pop it back off. So now, pretty simple plan of attack. I've got a card scraper I'm going to use to scrape down the high points of the epoxy. The surface of the countertops is pretty level, certainly level enough for a countertop. So I'm going to scrape it down just the high points of epoxy where it kind of mounted up a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the Festool Rotex sander and just start smoothing the whole thing, go through a few grits to get it nice and polished to the level I want and smooth. Again, it's very flat, so I don't really have to go through and flatten any high spots. Just have to go through, get all the seams nice and seamless for your fingers, and then just polish it to probably up through a 220, something like that. We'll see how it goes to 3 countertops. The epoxy that I put on, the dabs of epoxy in some of the gaps, might have been a little overkill. Going through the sanding process, ended up taking a lot of that epoxy back off. It really didn't get into those cracks as much as I wanted to. I knew that might be a problem in the past. You know, you can use like a vacuum on the other side, it kind of sucks in the epoxy, which is a great technique. But in this case, you know, I didn't have the opportunity. I have plywood on the other side. I just didn't want to go through the hassle. I thought it would kind of soak in there, but it really didn't. In some places it did, and that was great. Other places it didn't. So the finish is going to get in there anyway. Definitely not concerned about it. This is not going to end up being a cutting surface anyway. It's a countertop that won't be cut on, at least for the most part. So definitely not to worry about it. Might have been a little overkill, but it was a really fast step. Just had to wait overnight for it to dry, so really not a big deal. All 3 countertops are sanded and ready for finish. I didn't quite follow my plan. I started with the Festool sander on a Rotex mode with about 60 grit. And it was taking quite a while to get rid of those epoxy lines, the glue lines. So I have a drum sander, so I decided to switch over and go ahead and use the drum sander, make some passes with that. That went pretty quickly, still not super quick. I do have 3 of these, they're really big, and getting down to those epoxy lines and getting rid of them definitely took you know, a few passes. So I worked my way through 120, 180, and 220 paper on the drum sander with all 3 countertops, and that left, you know, scratch lines going you know, up and down this way on this end grain, and they're not that easy to get out either. But I did get rid of all the epoxy. Then I switched over to the Festool sander, and I jumped back. I went up through 220 on the drum sander. I had to jump back to about 80 grit. To get rid of the scratch lines in this end grain. This end grain on hard maple and Paduke really chews up the sandpaper. The drum sander worked great. I had to keep cleaning the paper of the sawdust, but other than that, the paper was fine. The Festool sander, paper's fine also, but it definitely, you know, I probably used a couple, you know, about 1 sheet per countertop piece. You know, I have 3 pieces, so basically, you know, 80 grit, really going through, getting rid of those scratch lines. That took the longest, and then pretty quickly through 120, 100, 120, 150, and 220. Those other grits went pretty quickly. So all in all, quite a few hours to really get this cleaned up. And then this end grain surface, I mean, it's really different than doing long grain when you're sanding it. It ends up just being really polished. So it chews up your sandpaper, but your sandpaper is getting finer, and it's really just polishing this end grain. So it takes a little bit longer, but it feels just awesome. So all done, got the scratch marks out, and now I'm ready for coats of finish.